It's time to bring women into consultative positions. It's time to bring women in where decisions are made. Why? Because we really believe complementarity is true, that we need both men and women.
When Pope Francis called for a more incisive female presence in the church, the lingering debate was infused with new life. But what exactly does an incisive presence of women look like at the Vatican and throughout the Catholic Church? Recently, Mary Hasson and a group of women scholars and writers have proposed some paths forward. Now is the time for real progress, they write. In Promise and Challenge, Catholic women reflect on feminism, complementarity, and the Church, today on Subject Matters.
Mary, this book is the product of a symposium that took place in 2014 on women in the church. And the starting point for it really is what Pope Francis has said in his pontificates, 3.5 years or so, about women in the church. What exactly has Pope Francis said that sparked this renewed discussion on women in the church today?
He said some wonderful things. He said that we need to have a deeper theology of women, and a lot of people wonder what does that mean, and we'll talk about that. But he talked mostly, I think what resonates with people is that he said there needs to be a more incisive presence of women in the church, and that women need to be where important decisions are made, and that women's presence is important. The church can't be the church without women, and he just has emphasized really what prior popes have taught so beautifully, that women have an equal dignity, they have an important role to play in the church. But what Francis has done, I think, is kind of opened the door and said, okay, let's make this real.
So tell me a little bit about the symposium and the authors in this book. How did this come about, and who are these women who are writing this really interesting theology on this topic?
Well, it was interesting when Pope Francis started talking about how women needed to be more of a presence and that women needed to be involved in shaping the conversation. I talked with Helen Alvarez, who's a friend, and we both just had the same sense of, okay, there's an opportunity here. Right. This is a time when we can bring together some great minds and to really think and say, how do we respond to what Pope Francis is asking for? He really wants women engaged in these questions. How should we participate more fully? What does complementarity mean? And so to really raise some of those questions and in an attitude of service. So we brought in Sister Sarah Butler, who served for 10 years on the International Theological Commission and is an authority on women's role in particular. She's written about the priesthood, the diaconate, and things like that. So she was a very important person for us to bring in. Helen Alvarez, but also several professors who were active in seminary teaching, Deb Savage and some others. So,
and even an economist.
Yes, an economist, yeah, Catherine Pokolic. Yes, which was excellent because we wanted to bring in, or as part of our discussions, it arose that we needed to pay attention to women's role in furthering the church's social teaching, and so an economist was a natural person to bring in.
You mentioned complementarity. I have it written down here because this is so crucial for understanding where all of you are coming from, as your starting point for developing this theology and this question. So what is complementarity? How do we have to understand it?
I think the way to understand complementarity is a value add. In other words, sometimes people think that when you're talking about men's and women's roles, that it's like a zero-sum game, that either men are more dominant and women are more hidden, or if women are trying to be more in the forefront, then that means men are losing something. And that's not at all what the church means. The church says men and women are equal in dignity, but we have differences, we have different gifts. But when we come together and collaborate in the way that we're supposed to, it's not just as good as if it's all men or all women. There's something greater that happens. So it's a value add. I think is the way that I like to think of it.
And it's sort of countercultural. Professor Elizabeth Schultz points out that the understanding of complementarity that you're describing actually rejects this premise that women will be seen as equal to men only if they're like men in every single way, and that this rejection can appear, especially to modern liberal feminists, as, quote, what she says, a retrenchment from a commitment to women's equality. So how do you explain to liberal feminists today that complementarity is not about obstructing equality?
Yeah, I think complementarity has gotten very bad press, okay, because I think people do automatically think, oh, you're talking about turning the clock back,
right,
where women were allowed to do some things but not others. And really what happened was with feminism, there was a diagnosis of a real problem. Women needed to be allowed to be independent human beings and have their own bank accounts and all these things, but to be able to carve out their own career path and things like that. But the problem was, in identifying some real problems, feminism sort of got off track because they thought the remedy was to prove women are just like men, or women are just as good as men. And in the process, they lost something valuable, which is that sense of we are women and we are different from men. But being women is not just good enough, it's more than good enough. That's what you need. That's what needs to be brought into the public square and into the church. It's women as women, not women as almost like men, just as good as men. So this whole notion of equality kind of got off track because equality was viewed as being just like men. So when I first started working as a lawyer, we put on our little ties, just like the guys, suits and ties, and you wouldn't have pictures of your kids because people would think on your desk, because people would think you're not serious, because women care about kids, but guys are all into their career. So right. It was a very false and artificial attempt to be something we weren't. And I think in recent years, feminism has realized that mistake. Why? Because women still want to be moms, they want to have families, and so they've started to speak to some of that. But at root, there's still this basic problem. They don't know how to affirm women as women and the gifts and that difference and see that as something valuable, which is something the church has always done and done so beautifully.
Right. Another dynamic here in this book, we were talking about some of the contributors, and it's safe to say that everybody who's contributing is kind of in the same school. You start on the same foundation, and that was purposely done, you told me, because the symposium was trying to build on this understanding, and making progress on this question of the role of women in the church. But there are many women in the church who would start from a different perspective on their, when they're thinking about this question. So I just want to ask you, what's the dialogue like between, you all who start from this point of view, but other women in the church, lay, religious, who disagree with maybe the starting point and approach the questions from a different angle?
Yeah, so first let me just be clear on the starting point. Our premise in this discussion, in our symposium and in the book, was we're not advocating to change church teaching. We are looking to see, okay, what in the future might change in terms of practice, or how do we implement complementarity in a way that really speaks to where the world is now, where the church is now. The need for evangelization, what does that look like? So our starting point really was, okay, we're faithful Catholics, we believe in the church's teaching, that's our starting point. So that framed our discussion. So the women that we asked into that conversation were women who were on the same page in terms of that being the starting point. However, I do know that many of the contributors here are in discussion with a number of women who would not take that as their starting point, and right. I think that's a good thing. But what I don't want to see happen is it be perceived as there are two camps, or the good camp, the bad camp, the in camp, the out camp, however you want to do that. I don't think that's helpful. So I think it's better for us to say, okay, these are our starting points, these are the insights, this is what we offer the church, and there are others who may start in a different place but still may be able to serve up something, very valuable insight or idea that should be taken very seriously.
Right. We have to take a quick break,
okay,
but when we come back, we'll look at some of the practical implications of all this theological discussion. And later, Tanya Geist is here. She's from the Institute for Church Life at Notre Dame University. We'll be right back after this.
Promise and Challenge, Catholic Women Reflect on Feminism, Complementarity, and the Church is published by Our Sunday Visitor and is available for purchase at osv.com and from Ben McNally Books in Toronto. Analogous to the public role of women in society as women, the greater presence in the Church of women as women wherever important decisions are made could be a humanizing force, correcting the tendencies toward bureaucratic clericalism and careerism. To see the feminine church is to remember what can easily be forgotten by the Petrine dimension, that it owes itself to something other than itself, and that it is in her service, leading from the last place.
Here with Mary Hasson discussing the book Promise and Challenge on Women in the Church today. And Mary, I remember doing an interview with Cardinal Sean O'Malley, who's the Archbishop of Boston, a few years ago. And I asked him, when Pope Francis called for a more incisive presence of women in the church, I asked him, what that meant. And he kind of chuckled and said, the church would come to a grinding halt if it weren't for all the women doing the things that they're doing in the church. Yeah. And it was this light bulb moment for me to say, actually, there are some incredible women doing incredible things at all levels, seemingly, of the church. Is part of this question simply recognizing that we don't always see that?
I think there are two aspects to it. One is exactly what the point you raised, that we do need to recognize that women have been present and working and contributing and serving the church in so many ways, not just for decades and not just in modern times, but really throughout our history. And so the church really elevated women by educating them, and sisters took positions of responsibility as heads of orders and conducting missionary activities and setting up schools and hospitals, doing these tremendous things. So, when the Cardinal's talking about that, those are the kinds of things that come to my mind, as well as kind of the more local thing that we all know, that our parishes would grind to a halt without the many women who do all sorts of things. But I think, so Pope Francis acknowledges that, just like Benedict and John Paul II often acknowledge that, just the great work of women in the history of the church. But what Pope Francis is talking about is something else. He's saying, okay, it's time to bring women into consultative positions. It's time to bring women in where decisions are made. Why? Because we really believe complementarity is true, that we need both men and women. So when we're not talking about something that's pertinent to the ordained ministry, we're talking about the church implementing or doing better in terms of how it evangelizes and understanding the challenges of our modern world. We need to hear from both men and women. And so this really is where I hope that you'll see more women moving in to be able to bring their wisdom, their expertise, their feminine gifts, their experience. And especially since half the world is female. So if we're going to learn how to speak better and communicate better, which is something else that Pope Francis has emphasized, I think we need women's gifts in there at that level.
What is it going to take for the men who are in the leadership roles in the church, so specifically priests and bishops, to really open up to this and to not be kind of fearful, frightened by it, and say, no, this is something good. This is something that the church needs today.
I think we have to acknowledge, especially as women, we have to acknowledge that there have been problems in the relationship, but some of it I think was created by the way that the question of women's ordination kind of took over center stage and became the only conversation about women in the church. And the church is clear, women are not going to be ordained priests. And so to the extent that just kind of monopolized the conversation, and it made, I think, a lot of priests and bishops feel a little bit defensive. If you have a woman coming and saying, let's talk about women doing more, they're thinking, wait a minute, this is settled. Let's not get into this conversation. So I think there was a defensiveness, and some of it justified in terms of, let's not rehash this. But really where we are now is a different point. And what I hope we'll see is that priests and bishops are very open to the fact that, my gosh, we've got a huge challenge in front of us. The world needs the Lord's message. The world needs faithful witnesses and needs more hands in the vineyard. And so that's where I think women will be embraced to do whatever we can in a spirit of service.
What are we looking at concretely? I mean, would you like to see, women at high levels in the Vatican bureaucracy, or simply consultative bodies, or what would something practical look like that you would hope would be a sign of this change?
Yeah, well, I think it might be easiest to see in looking back at the Synod on the Family. I think it was a valid criticism that if you're talking about the family, you needed to have more women in there contributing, not because what men were saying wasn't right, but that part of the conversation I think is missing but also maybe some of the solutions are missing, because the whole idea of complementarity is a value add.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about ordinary Catholic women. At one point in the book, you write that in too many places, the church is not caring for the woman in the pew. There's a sense that many women in the average Catholic parish do not find themselves growing spiritually or deepening their intellectual understanding of the faith. They feel disconnect and rarely avail themselves of parish spirituality programs. For some women, the teachings of the church seem theoretical and inapplicable to the real struggles of their family and personal lives. Women searching for spiritual growth, fellowship, and practical guidance on things like prayer, child rearing, financial stewardship, and marriage, among other issues, too often come up empty in Catholic parishes. That seems to be a huge problem, isn't it?
It is, and we don't want to lose women because they feel disconnected. So what I would say to women is, if that's you, if you feel like there's nothing out there for the church, go online, find the resources that are out there, and bring them to your parish. There's Endow, there's Walking with Purpose, there's Women of Grace, there are a lot of women's Bible studies. Figure out what it is that you're missing and take the initiative and bring it to your pastor. And then the other thing I would say to parishes is that women, we're used to looking at the internet and finding things that speak to us. So instead of having a website that just says sacraments, mass times, all that, put women up there and have a drop-down menu with all the different ways that women can connect. A mom's group, a Bible study, an over 60 group, whatever it is, so that women see themselves, see how they would plug in. And that's a way to draw people in.
It's very interesting that a few of the contributors in this book actually address the role of men in this whole discussion about women. And Professor Teresa Farnan actually writes that Pope Francis's call for a more profound theology of women inevitably leads us from considerations of complementarity to the realization that the dignity and vocation of women requires men to live up to their own dignity and vocation. What is the role of men in this whole discussion?
Well, if you're going to talk about a feminine genius, shouldn't you talk about a masculine genius? I think it's that idea of complementarity, that it's not one side or the other, that if we're going to understand women more fully, we have to understand men more fully. And I think for men, it's important to think of yourselves as fathers, just as women are called to motherhood, whether it's actual motherhood, physical motherhood, spiritual motherhood. We have a mother's heart. I think for men too. You know, you're called to be fathers, whether it's literally having your own children, whether being a spiritual father as an ordained father, or just in your attitudes and your the gifts that you bring to every situation. So we're a relational people, and we understand each other in relationship.
We have Tanya Geist here to do a review of Promise and Challenge for us. She is from the Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame, and then she's going to pose a question to you, Mary.
All right.
Tanya.
The book Promise and Challenge is a hugely valuable resource. And while I think that's the case for a whole host of reasons, right now I'm just going to touch on a couple of them. First of all, on a pastoral level, it is so essential, and yet not necessarily that common, for women today to really feel themselves to be a part of a community. We need role models to figure out what life might look like for a Catholic woman who takes her faith seriously, whether at home or at work. The contributors to this book really give credence to the presence of that community in our country today, and they also shed a lot of light on what it means to be a woman, right down to the details. And that brings me to my second point, which is that a better understanding of what it means to be a woman can only then lead to a better understanding of what it means to be a person in the first place, created by God. And that kind of understanding is so lacking in our culture today. Now, on to my question. In her chapter, Elizabeth Schultz draws out the following quote from Pope Benedict XVI, and he writes, "In today's intellectual climate, only the masculine principle counts. That means doing, achieving results, actively planning and producing the world oneself. Given our Western masculine mentality, we have increasingly separated Christ from his mother, without grasping that Mary's motherhood might have some significance for theology and faith." Schultz situates Benedict's insight within her own two-pronged question. And she writes, "Is it possible that women, as icons of Mary, can offer to the church these two particular gifts?" the motherly gift of understanding the trust we must place in God, and the contemplative gift of prophecy in a way that's particularly called for today. I love the way that the importance of Mary's role, both in the church and the world, is drawn out in this section. And so I was wondering if you could comment a bit further on it. Thanks, Mary.
Okay, Mary's role in our understanding of the church and the world today. What can we say about it in the context of this discussion on women in the church?
I think we need to see Mary, first of all, as our mother. And what does a mother do? A mother, well, Mary in particular brings us to her son, but a mother teaches, a mother guides, a mother cares for. And so we need to see the church in the same way, so that Mary, the church, there's this whole idea of mothering and motherhood, and that needs to draw something out of us in particular. How do we respond to that? And if we look at Mary and we look at the church, it calls for trust. Christ entrusted us to his mother, just as he entrusted Mary to John, but he entrusted us to his mother, just as children are entrusted to their mothers. So there's this whole trust thing. The way that we're going to grow in trust of God and in trust of the Lord's will for us is to work through the church, because that's who he's given us to lead us towards that trust. And there's another element of Mary that I think is really important, and it's kind of the prophetic role. And this is a role that women, I think, are naturally suited for, in one sense, as one of our writers said, because women seeing the whole and women pondering things in our hearts, just as Mary did, sometimes that gives you a better frame of mind from which to reflect and to see something and maybe raise an issue or to encourage a certain direction. And so Mary played a prophetic role, but I think women are called to do that as well.
What about the role of mothering? A number of the contributors talk about this in the book, and you bring it up, I think, in the final chapter about how women are no longer identifying themselves with motherhood.
Right.
And this is something that is a problem in our society, but how do we deal with this? What are Catholic women saying about this trend in our society today?
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, but true, that women, while most women still aspire to be mothers, that's less and less part of the conversation. I think that's an unfortunate byproduct of where feminism has taken us, with this idea of being like men and your fulfillment is your career and all these things, where motherhood just was not only not part of the conversation, but if it did come up, it was seen as a burden and something that was going to hold women back. And yet, women, there's something in us. We have room for another. I mean, quite literally. Women are made with room for another. And so there's something in women's hearts that naturally draws us out towards the other person. So I think as Catholics, I think it's really important that we kind of rehabilitate the idea of motherhood, that motherhood is a gift, it's not a burden. If society has not responded well, has not provided the support, or has not made room for mothers in terms of the workplace or other things, that's a different problem. But the problem is not motherhood. The problem is that society has not responded well. And in a sense, the way things developed, they kind of got away with that too. If all you have to do is just not be a mom, well, you never have to fix the problem of how you make room for mothers. And yet that requires women to really deny a part of themselves. So there is a problem in terms of women are not appreciating motherhood in the same way. But I think we can change that conversation. And I think that's important for women to understand, if they're going to understand Mary and understand the church. The church is always talking about Mary as mother, but if that's not resonating, it's a problem.
We have to take one more break,
Okay.
but when we come back, some concluding thoughts from Mary Hasson on promise and challenge. Don't go anywhere.
Progress regarding women's presence in the church should be measured less by the numbers of women appointed to significant positions within the church's structure, although that is surely important, and more by the transformative impact of an integral complementarity put into practice more broadly in parish ministries, education, social work, business, and healthcare.
Mary, so much of what comes out in the book has to do with communications, how we communicate. And in the final chapter, you specifically talk about the need not only for communication, but translation. In other words, we have to find a new language almost for articulating what we're about to women, to society, to the church today? And you see women playing a key role in that.
I do, and from two perspectives. One of our chapter authors, Erica Bacciacci, wrote in particular about the need to translate the church's sexual teachings into a language that women can understand, or with examples, and to really take into account how they've been formed and their understandings, where they're coming from. So where women are called to play a huge role here, I think, is both in identifying where there's this disconnect, which language doesn't resonate, and then to help perhaps to craft language and framings of things that are going to be more successful at communicating the truth. So we're not talking about changing the truth, we're talking about how do you get it across to people in a way that touches their hearts, that's going to resonate. But I think another related piece of that is that women need to be very much at the forefront in being messengers of the truth. Because I think that's important, not just for how it looks, but because that's how we live complementarity. But also women speak to women in a way that sometimes can get through where there might be barriers otherwise. So.
No.
Not you.
Yeah. I have one final question for you. You mentioned in the book that this is, one small contribution to this major discussion that's going on. But when you look at where this discussion on women in the church is heading, what do you personally hope comes out of it?
I hope, one, there will be more discussion because there are always new practical challenges and circumstances, so this is not a once and for all discussion. I hope there will be more players, more people pulled into the discussion, and I hope there will be some changes. I hope that women will have a chance to bring in an attitude of service, love, and humility, the insights that we have, and to really work side by side, with our brothers in Christ, and to convert hearts and change the world.
We can't do it without each other, can we?
That's right.
Mary Hasson, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
The book is Promise and Challenge: Catholic Women Reflect on Feminism, Complementarity, and the Church, edited by Mary Hasson. You can get it right here at Ben McNally Books in downtown Toronto, or from our good friends over at Our Sunday Visitor. They're at osv.com. I want to thank our guest reviewer today, Tanya Geist. She's from the Institute for Church Life at the University of Notre Dame. And remember, if you want to see my video review of Promise and Challenge, head over to our website, saltandlighttv.org/subject matters. And there you'll also find a wonderful reflection by the Reverend Dr. Dorcas Gordon. You have to check it out, it's very insightful. That's all for this episode of Subject Matters. We'll see you again next time.
To learn more about Mary Hasson and the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., visit eppc.org/programs/Catholic-Women-Forum. Our Salt and Light team works hard to feature authors and books that are meaningful to you, our viewers. Your financial contribution to Salt and Light Television ensures such quality Catholic programming. Please consider supporting our original series Subject Matters by making a donation today.